what's incredible about Rothko's work is the scale or lack of it. So for example, even just this here looks like it could be an architectural sketch for the interior of a living room or the interior of a castle courtyard. A lot of Rothko's work has a human scale to it. They do mimic the proportions and the scales of a window or a door or a threshold or a room. The architecture of Mark Rothko. I'm really not going to start this video by giving any sort of in-depth introduction to Rothko. If you don't know who Rothko is, that's fine, but you probably do know his art. I mean, it's a bit hard to ignore, especially if you're an architect or an architecture student. I think Rothko's work's really interesting because he's probably one of those artists that many people who sort of don't know better will look at and scoff and say, I could do that, but you couldn't. You couldn't do it. I know for a fact you couldn't do it because I've tried to do it and I couldn't do it. So it's not easy to do. And I just think that's such a childlike reading of the work, which is interesting. Then again, maybe that's also valid. But I used to say that sort of thing. I think the first time I saw some of Rothko's work was in the States, and I was just sort of like, meh, whatever. But then obviously 15 to 20 years of architecture school and working in architecture will sort of sober you up, and you'll suddenly realize that it's actually an incredible body of work. But how does it relate to architecture? Let's get into it. I'm going to try and be careful here to not move my screen around too wildly. This is just a little sample of some of the work, which we're all sort of somewhat familiar with. I think there's a number of ways in which we can engage with Rothko's paintings. There is how it relates to architecture physically, the spaces with which it is displayed, the spaces with which it was created, and the spaces which have been inspired by the works in a number of ways. But we can also sort of talk about it from an architectural point of view that is more interested in the technical qualities of the work, you know, the skill required to sort of make someone feel a certain way, which is a skill that I think is apparent in the very best architecture as well, which I'm going to talk about. And then I think there's also a spiritual aspect to it and how it relates to architecture in the way in which we read it. And it sounds terrible to say, but consume the art. I think Rothko's paintings have this incredible architectural quality. I mean, they almost look like diagrams for a building or a space in a strange way. There are organizational principles at play here. There is depth, whether we want to engage with that depth or not. And when I say depth, I don't necessarily mean intellectual depth. Of course there is. I'm talking about spatial depth. Believe it or not, I believe that there's an incredible 3D quality to these images. Images. I mean, I guess I'm looking at the pixels on a screen here, so it is an image. I'm talking about the painting. There is an incredible 3D quality to the paintings. And I think the magic of Rothko's work is that he is able to sort of compress that thinking into a 2D surface or a singular flat surface, which is what really gives it its raw abstract quality. I don't know if that makes sense to anyone who's listening to this. Do keep me honest in the comments though, because I'm going to get some of this wrong. And really all this video is just my way of sort of enjoying Rothko in the context of architecture. But I mean, we love to look at Rothko's work and sort of suggest that it's unique and different from his contemporaries like Jackson Pollock, in that it isn't as expressive or gestural maybe, in that it's much more considered and thorough and thought through. And I think that's quite evident in Rothko's sketches. I think you'll see here that I've got a little Peter Märkli sketch here included I'm going to talk about in a second. I mean, if I was teaching an architecture student and they brought me sketches like this, I'd probably just give them an A before they did anything else. And I don't really know how to articulate why that is the case. I understand that there's a bias here and that I'm looking at sketches from a famous world-renowned artist. Like, I know that. But let's just remove Rothko from the equation here. Like, these sketches are sensational because they're all doing two things at the same time. I would argue that there are organizational and structural principles at play here, but then they're also making me feel something. And isn't that like the greatest trick an artist can sort of play on a person? And architects can do this too. And I just think that's sensational. I think these sketches are, in a way, similarly as rich as the paintings themselves. Maybe some people disagree with that. Because, am I looking at an idea here for an urban plan? Am I looking at a grid for a graphic novel? Am I looking at the design of a piece of sculpture? Am I looking at an architectural idea? Or am I just looking at 4 boxes with no clear, distinct visual hierarchy? I mean, that's where the richness comes from, in that as an observer, you can almost sort of project your own thinking onto it. Because I do think Rothko's work is both simple and complex at the same time. And I think that complexity, that challenge, is what makes the art so great. And even this one particularly is incredibly architectural, because what's incredible about Rothko's work is the scale or lack of it. So, for example, even just this here looks like it could be an architectural sketch for the interior of a living room or the interior of a castle courtyard. And I think that's what gives these sketches such richness that really excites me. And again, with the exception of maybe the Seagram Murals, which we're going to talk about in a minute, a lot of Rothko's work has a human scale to it. They do mimic the proportions and the scales of a window or a door or a threshold or a room. Not the Seagram Murals necessarily, but we'll talk about that shortly. And I've placed the Peter Märkli sketch here, which is wonderful. Peter Märkli's sketches are incredible as a side-by-side here. And I've also added it here with the Magritte pipe. This is not a pipe for those who do not speak French. I do not speak French, but I'm pretty sure that's what that says. There's a really interesting sort of intellectual challenge at play here. And it really does challenge an individual's sort of visual literacy. And it reminds, but it is a pipe, but it's not a pipe. It's, a painting or a representation of a pipe. In the same way that this is not a building or a piece of architecture. It's the representation of a piece of architecture. This is not a painting. It's, the sketch of a painting. And in many ways, I find it really interesting that this is for a painting, this is for a building, but this resembles a painting much more than this resembles a painting. That's just my reading of it. It reminds me of a kind of really aggressive conversation I had with a boss once when I was working in architecture practice. He kept asking me to show him the building. And what he meant was the design of the building, my drawings. And I had to stop and be like, this isn't the building. These are the drawings. And I know you could argue that I was just sort of being incredibly semantic and pedantic about the terminology, but I do think there's a weight to words when it comes to design. Because if you were to suggest that this is the building, then what's the point in building the building? This is it. And I think we have to be careful and be clear that this work is process. It's not the destination. I'd argue that Rothko's work itself is not a destination. It fits into a very specific artistic and architectural lineage that I'm going to talk about shortly. And really that comes back to the Magritte pipe, and it's really just sort of a test on your sort of visual aptitude. Of course, it's not a pipe. It's the representation of a pipe. That's what sort of art is, unless you're looking at the art itself, in which case the art is the art. Anyway, I think, though, I was talking about how we do need to look at the spaces with which we need to look at the architectural spaces with which Rothko's work is displayed and was created. We have 2 photographs here of his studio in New York. I have to be honest, I don't have an awful lot to say about this, other than that for his, sensational and emotional and sort of natural the work is, there was a technical system with which it was created. And I think that's important to talk about, almost like the work behind the work, like the architecture behind the art. The space had to be perfectly calibrated to create this work. The work wasn't just created in a vacuum. And the work also shouldn't be viewed and enjoyed and displayed in a vacuum either, which is why just looking at JPEGs on a white space is so reductive in a way. It's not ideal. But I mean, I can't bring you all to Tate Modern and shut it down for the day and give a tour of the work. It's not really my work to talk about, is it? Again, this is Tate Modern, and I think these are the Seagram Murals, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And guys, look, I promised you a throughway here between Rothko, Willy Wonka, and Peter Märkli. I'm going to get there. A little bit of Michelangelo along the way, but just bear with me. Again, I'm a big fan of Alex Mandrajev's work. Alex Mandrajev is probably one of my favorite sort of digital artists working today, but Rothko's influence is obviously very, in my opinion, I'm reading a lot of Rothko in his work. However, what I think is quite interesting between Alex Mandra's work and Rothko's work, one is digital, one is physical, of course. But I was speaking earlier with the sketches. Let me see if I can pull the sketch over. Let's get this guy. And let's bring him over. Coming with me sketch. This is just my reading of Alex's work. I don't know Alex personally, but I'm a massive, massive, massive fan of Alex's work. If we just sort of look, really what I see in Alex's work is the sort of, it's almost like the Rothko effect with the architectural detail rather than the absence of the architectural detail. So maybe it's actually more relevant to put one of these down here at the same time. And I'm not talking about color. I'm just talking about detail or lack of. And I find that really interesting. Ignore Michelangelo down here. He's coming up in a minute. It's my way of saying, though, that Alex's work to me is almost like another step in that lineage that's clearly been inspired by Rothko's work. The way in which it's less abstract and more literal. So, for example, like if you look at the way in which you may read a horizon line in some of Rothko's work, Alex translates that into light and shade within a space. And obviously, it's just sensational work too. I just really and it's really scary. Look at this little spooky dude. I've just really wanted an excuse to talk about Alex Mandrajev's paintings for a long time. So maybe this is it. But I was talking more specifically about the way in which the spaces with which we actually enjoy and view Rothko's work. And this is going to sound quite contentious, but I'm actually, as much as I love Rothko's work, I'm not a massive fan of Rothko Chapel or the museum spaces with which you sort of observe the work. I almost feel like it's a paradox of sorts to place Rothko's energy in this sort of tomb-like space. But maybe that's the greatest irony of Rothko's work when we talk about Michelangelo's the Laurentian library in a minute. Sorry, I'm rambling. I'm all over the place at the minute. But it's almost as if like Philip Johnson and the boys almost designed Rothko Chapel as a punishment of sorts. There is a really interesting story here that I can talk about in a minute. When I was working as an architectural visualizer, I was actually created this space. Can I bring this to the front? I think I can. I was designing a gallery. Or I wasn't designing a gallery, I was working on a gallery. And the client didn't have any Rothko in the collections, but I was just sort of like, this is so boring. The space was just so boring and raw. And it's like, wouldn't it be cool if we just added some Rothkos to it? And really what I was doing is I was just translating these JPEGs from the internet into my space. And I just sort of realized that I wasn't actually giving the work the respect it deserved, because there are a whole series of different parameters with which this work should be observed and enjoyed and studied. And sometimes, like here, I think museums get it right. And then in other cases, I don't know, there's just something about this. Rothko has a history with Philip Johnson, of course, that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But it just, I don't know. It's almost like we don't need it. I don't know. Am I saying that right? There's just something not quite right about it. It's almost like it translates the work into this like church-like experience, almost like a pilgrimage. Whereas in my opinion, the work belongs. I mean, I guess this is the chapel, isn't it? Being built. But I mean, if you look at the work here, I think this is in the chapel, which is really interesting. Rothko obviously had passed away before it was built, but either this is a construction. No, I think this must be a studio space of sorts. This is where the work sort of belongs, right here, I think. Spaces which are raw, dusty, and just sort of very authentic. I just think extreme curation of the work does it a disservice, but that's just my reading of it. Speaking of curation, let's talk about the Seagram Murals. Yeah, I just don't like this project. Just don't like it. Let's talk about the Seagram Murals. So I don't think we can really talk about Rothko without talking about Mies van der Rohe, Seagram, and Philip Johnson, which I've sort of hinted at already. So I'm not sure on the entire. I'm not really sure of all the specifics of the story. But Rothko was commissioned basically to create a series of paintings for the Four Seasons, which was to be New York's most fancy up and coming restaurant for rich people, basically. And Rothko accepted the commission. I think he was paid something like $300,000 back in like 1958, which by today's standards probably like $1 billion. Who knows? So Rothko accepted, and I've got some images here of the Four Seasons and the Seagram. But I mean, like, the Four Seasons had Picasso's, it had Jackson Pollock's, and now it was to have Rothko's. So Rothko accepted the commission, and then if I've got the timeline right, he sort of, I think he visited Florence in Italy and spent quite a bit of time admiring this. Am I saying this right? The Laurentian Library by Michelangelo in Florence, which is what we're looking at right now. I think I've got a plan for this here. I do. Not this Michelangelo. I'm just going to get rid of him. That was a stupid joke. Yeah, here is the plan. Now, I can't speak for Rothko. I've read quite a bit around the subject already. Many people give different accounts. Give different accounts on this story, but Rothko hated the Four Seasons, and he hated the people who would eat there. And the whole idea behind the Seagram Murals was to sort of punish the people who would eat there by making them feel trapped and stuck and controlled and isolated in a chamber of their own sort of wealth and greed. And a massive inspiration for the Seagram Murals was this space in particular, the vestibule of the Laurentian Library in Florence. I think this is an incredible space, but I think it's a terrible space at the same time. And the idea that Rothko would sort of translate this spatial horror into his space and then share that with the diners of the Four Seasons is, in my opinion, quite hilarious. I mean, even if we just sort of look and study the composition of the interior of the space, there is a lot to admire architecturally, obviously, but it does sort of translate in many ways into the Seagram Murals themselves in an abstract way. And also, it's quite funny to note that that there is an exhibition actually on this month in Rothko in Florence. And I believe some of his work is going to be on display there. So if you're in Florence, check it out. Almost a way of sort of architecture meeting art, meeting architecture across the space of maybe 200 years, which is quite interesting. But in any case, Rothko hated rich people. He hated Philip Johnson. He hated Mies van der Rohe, and he decided he was going to punish them. But before the work was actually displayed in the Four Seasons, Rothko and his wife decided to go for lunch when it opened. And he was so disgusted by the price, he was so disgusted by the bill that he just cancelled the commission entirely and was like, nah, not doing it anymore. So the Seagram Murals were donated, and I think today you can now see them in Tate Modern. And occasionally I think they go on tour. So why am I talking about this, and what does this have to do with architecture? I find it fascinating that the psychological horror of an architectural space can translate into the 2D surface of a painting. I guess really that's just the thesis of this video. I find that really interesting. But not only can we go from 3D to 2D, we can also go from 2D back into 3D, which I'm going to talk about now in a second, which again, I find quite interesting. I'm saying that quite a lot. So I guess if we wanted to see what sort of the way in which, a painting can be a building, it's quite simple to look at a number of examples. Barragán is an interesting example. Soane is an example with Turner. Artwork by James Turrell is another interesting example, how we can sort of capture the magic of art and translate it into three-dimensional space or an experience. But I do think there's a lineage here between Michelangelo, Rothko's Seagram Murals, and Daniel Libeskind right here, in that what if we just sort of are only interested in designing architecture that evokes a feeling or a mood or a reaction. This is a famous space in the Jewish Museum by Daniel Libeskind. But furthermore, we're seeing this more and more now with digital space. We're seeing it in video games. The Backrooms is another example. I love this corridor in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. I told you I would land this plane. Connect this to Willy Wonka. Just the idea that the uncanny valley of it, there is a horror in recognizing what is familiar, but it's not correct. And architecture plays a part in that. We see it, even Rothko's work, in my opinion, translates into some of the best Japanese horror of the last sort of, 30 years. Silent Hill. The save button in Silent Hill, in my opinion, references a Rothko painting. Only when you sort of interact with it, you end up becoming physically consumed by it. You enter, different planes of existence, which is just super interesting. We've got a lot of stuff here with Sam Lake, Control, Remedy Studio. I think Rothko's influence on culture, architectural culture, art culture, and pop culture is very sort of profound, if subtle, in many ways. I wanted to just sort of include these two images here by Barragán, because I'm going to sort of finish this little ramble here about some specific architectural projects. I think these images are great. I think color in architecture is beautiful, but in my opinion, this is quite a literal translation of sort of, this and what's the other one I'm thinking of? Mies van der Rohe, Mondrian, Gerrit Rietveld, Richter, all of these sort of famous 20th century paintings, artists and architecture sort of coexisting. But what I want to talk about to sort of finish this out, and how to me Rothko is architecture and the architecture of Rothko is worth discussing, is how it translates in a more subtle, interesting and architectural language. So I'm going to talk about three projects here now. I'm going to talk about this project now, Palace by Tom DePaor, who's an incredible Irish architect. This is a project that is in Galway, Ireland. I was recently reading an interview with Tom DePaor and Patrick Lynch of Lynch Architects, who, again, I'm a massive fan of. And they were talking about how the concrete and the mass and the weight of this building at certain times will absorb the weather of the site. And what will happen is that if we look at the sort of surface detail of the architecture itself, it can take on a second reading at certain times of the year, simply based on the way in which it can absorb weather. And I think the architect, Tom DePaor mentions it, he describes it as this effect that can occur in the building where when it rains at certain times, the surface of the interior stair can be red through the rain, and it creates this amazing sort of artistic effect. Unfortunately, I can't find a photograph of it, but what I'm talking about here is that if Rothko is all about surface, 2D surface, I think a lot of these works are very much about architectural surface translated in 3D. Again, this is work by Peter Märkli, which is incredible. It's almost as if you can read the loose softness, the dematerialization of the fabric of the building underneath, but then the environment, the weather and time add to that surface, which make it even richer. Now, I know there might be some architects in the comments who are like, what am I talking about? This is wild. But I'm like, this is just my reading of it. Like, I think this is incredible. And I think this is what makes this architecture really, really great. Again, this is an interior of an apartment building by Peter Märkli, but in my opinion, the surface, the richness of it and the way in which it can kind of degrade and age and change and color over time based on the time of day and based on which, the way in which a reader is experiencing the space. I just think that's phenomenal. Now, to the everyday person, you may look at this and think it's quite ugly, and that's fine. But at the same time, I would argue, is that dissimilar from a Rothko? I mean, how many people visit these paintings and think, I could do that. It's ugly. I don't like it. So, to each his own, I guess. Again, this is, how am I saying this? Am I saying this correct? I got to check the name of it again. I want to be careful here. This is La Congiunta. Don't know if I'm saying that right, which is an art gallery in itself. So, it's almost like, if a lot of people argue about Frank Gehry and the Guggenheim, or not Frank Gehry, Frank Gehry's Guggenheim and Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim, and that the buildings as objects almost compete with the art themselves. But what if we sort of take that further and we're more subtle about it and less egotistical about it, and we argue that the building itself can exist as art and it can house art within it? I just find that quite interesting. So, and then of course I want to talk a little bit about Peter Zumthor here. I think this is Kunsthaus Bergens. Am I saying that right? In Austria, an incredible piece of architecture. But again, it's like the sketches of Rothko, and the paintings themselves, we can read the structure in it. We can see the structure in the sketches. We know that there's architectural thinking there, but what actually comes from it is what we feel by looking at it, which to me, when I look at these buildings and spaces, it's just poetry, isn't it? Like, it's just pure architectural, artistic poetry. And I'm saying that and also being very willing to admit you might think it's ugly and it might not be for you. I do think architecture students and young architects should study art more when studying architecture. I just think it's important. I think there is an architecture in Rothko's work that just doesn't get discussed that often. And it's fair to say that maybe this is just my reading of it and it might not necessarily be correct or valid. But I wanted to make this video to sort of showcase that there is a through line between all things architecture and art. And I think we should celebrate it and discuss it more. And I hope this was useful and enjoyable to anybody watching. This is going to be a new series now where I'm going to really just discuss how everyday things in art, architecture, design, films, games, media translate to architecture. So if you like it, you enjoy it, I would really appreciate it if you could smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, engage with the content, and let me know what you'd like me to talk about next. There's going to be a weekly series now. So this is the architecture of Rothko. Hope you enjoyed it. All the best and goodbye.